Theresa May tried to do it in 2017. Boris Johnson tried it in 2019. Rishi Sunak had another go in 2023. And Keir Starmer had an attempt last year. Now, Andy Burnham is the latest Prime Minister to try and help young people who don't want to go to university. Can he be the one that finally cracks it? Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and later on we're going to be heading to Manchester to find about the by-election to find a new mayor, since Andy Burnham famously vacated that spot. But first of all, we're going to look at something that Andy Burnham says he's got a good track record on when he was mayor of Manchester, which is doing something to address the gap between academic education and vocational training. And this big idea that he's now rolling out across the whole of England is more access to more subjects that include vocational ones at an earlier age. So I've got two people who can help me try and work out what this all means, because sometimes it can be a bit of an alphabet soup. Well, here with me in the studio is Shane Chowen, who's the editor at FE Week. FE meaning further education. Hello, Shane.
Hi.
Big day for you.
Huge. Quite a grenade to launch right before the summer break.
True. And in terms of announcements for further education, this is quite a big one then.
It is quite a big one, but we've kind of been here before.
You've had a few big ones before.
We've had a few false starts on this parity of esteem issue over the years.
Yeah, well, we can come on to that in a second, because we're also joined by Justine Greening, former Conservative Education Secretary, and she's now founder of the Purpose Coalition, which aims to improve social mobility. Hello, Justine.
Hi, how are you doing?
Very well, thank you. Good to catch up. So, Shane, if we just do the details of what Andy Burnham has announced today, and then we can talk about the bigger picture with Justine. So what's the lay person's version of what he's announced today?
So what Andy Burnham has announced today is his vision for basically from 2028, young people who are 14 years old going into year 10, when they're doing their options, will have or should have access to a wider range of technical training options alongside their core subjects, English, maths and science. So the stuff that's been talked about, things like AI, manufacturing, engineering, construction, we need to build all these houses, health and social care and the sort.
And here is a bit of Andy Burnham announcing it while he was visiting a train factory in Derby on Tuesday morning.
It brings some hope to a lot of young people in this country who know the education system is not built for them. Well, now they have a Prime Minister who's saying, I am for you, and I will build an education system that works for you, that treats all students coming through school as equals. The academic and the technical routes in parity, offering equal paths for all young people. And I think that brings hope to a lot of young people, to a lot of families in this country. And you can see it behind, the amazing young people we've met here today.
Right. So, Justine, a few things I want to get your take on. So, first of all, that big thing of the parity of esteem, as Shane was describing it. So, treating vocational training as well as the same way as more academic routes. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but weren't you trying to do that when you were Education Secretary, which was a little while ago?
Yeah, well, it's a good point. I mean, I introduced the apprenticeship levy. I announced that we would be bringing in T-levels. And so I do think it's a welcome step from the Prime Minister. But you're right. Over the last decade, lots of governments have sought to try to create this vocational pathway. I'd actually argue, if anything, I'd like Andy Burnham to go further, and that this didn't, in a way, go far enough. I, for some time, have felt that employers need to be more involved in GCSE curriculum development. And in a sense, I still think we've got this differential between vocational education and then there's other education that's academic. Actually, we should be asking all education to be building those pathways for young people into employment. So this is a really welcome step from my perspective from the Prime Minister. I think let's keep it going.
And we'll talk about the involvement of business and a secretary. But Shane, why is it giving people more options earlier might lead to more parity between the vocational and the academic route?
I think what Andy Burnham will have seen as Mayor of Greater Manchester over the years are lots of reforms to education in the post-16 space. Justine mentioned T-levels, apprenticeships. He would have seen all of that happen at a 16-plus angle. And what he's done today is said, well, actually, we need to be intervening earlier, giving people choices earlier. And as Mayor of Greater Manchester, he didn't have any power to do that. He didn't control what Ofsted inspects, and part of the announcement today was that Ofsted will be doing more to hold schools to account in terms of the options that they're giving young people. He had a convening power to bring employers around the table to get them in to, offer advice on the curriculum, maybe be lending some staff for guest teaching and all that kind of stuff. But all that needs to be ramped up now. On a massive scale. Our further education colleges are already full because we're in a demographic upturn in the number of 16-year-old school leavers. So there's another announcement today announcing some more cash for extra college places because they are literally full. So if we're going to be now asking, schools for, to free up classrooms of 14-year-olds to come and do health and social care, we need space, and also teachers, because we also have a chronic teacher crisis in colleges.
Well, Justine, that was going to be the second thing I got your take on. As a former education secretary, you're picturing yourself in your office in Westminster. The Prime Minister's just made this announcement. Hasn't he lumbered you, if you were the education secretary now, and the entire school system in England with a whole load of extra work and a whole load of new teachers and facilities to find so that these new options can be offered as early as 14?
I just would see it completely positively, that it's long overdue.
Oh, no, I'm not seeing it negatively. I'm just trying to get a sense from you of like how big a challenge that is to deliver it.
Yeah, but the challenge is always getting money out of the Treasury. And that's a lot easier when the Prime Minister's personally announced the strategy that you're wanting to pursue. So no, I think a lot of people in the DfE will be quite rightly, as Shane says, thinking, how are we going to get around the mechanics of what we do? And there's almost two binding constraints. One is the teaching capacity and the resource behind that. And actually, I think, as Shane will say, introducing T levels for FE, has had some real challenge. FE often needs capital investment to teach applied courses.
To like build a workshop, say.
Exactly. So there's that piece of it. That's one side. But the other piece of it is employers. And if you look at how challenging it's been for T levels to get established and take off, that's partly been that you need companies that will do high quality work placements. I think what Andy Burnham will really need to focus on this is how he mobilises businesses to be part of this solution. So all of my work with the Purpose Coalition is about getting businesses to put in place social mobility strategies. How are they actually going to, in a strategic way, extend their opportunities into communities that don't currently have them? How are they going to really ensure that they're turbocharging careers for people already there? There's a lot of thinking out there, Adam, on how to do this, but I don't think there's a policy environment, in a sense, to recognise and reward companies that have got good solutions. And so I think if Burnham can get onto that landscape and that piece of this, he really will start to make an impact.
Okay, some other ideas for him there. But Shane, there is a business element to what's actually been announced today, isn't there?
Yeah, huge. So local areas will decide for themselves what kind of routes 14-year-olds will have access to. So there are these things called local skills improvement plans, which businesses have been brought together to produce, which basically say what are the needs in our area around skills. There's 39 of them around the country. I've been through them all. They're all fairly similar, actually. Everywhere wants to be a sexy green skills, digital engineering,
AI
everywhere,
sciences.
all of that kind of stuff. But the idea is that local businesses will be like convened by their mayors or local leaders, if there isn't a mayor, with the schools, with the colleges, and then between them have to work out how this stuff is going to be deliverable.
And is that things like, as you were hinting at earlier, an expert or a technician or something from a business going into the school to provide the subject teaching for the 14-year-olds?
I think in part it has to be. It has to be. There are we run a story back in April where thousands of students couldn't go to college to do a construction course because colleges didn't have enough construction teachers. The reason why we don't have enough construction teachers is because we can't pay them enough to come off site and teach their subject, especially if they're a really good builder, and that's who we want teaching the next generation. So there are still some huge sums that need to be resolved. But also, I know I said I was going to try and be positive about this, but budgets and spending reviews tend to be where arguments around parity go to die. So we'll talk again at Christmas, and I'll give you the
because it's too expensive to, as Justine was saying, to provide the facilities or the time or the resources you need.
It's the human and the physical capital that needs to be. You need some upfront investment in that kind of stuff. Absolutely.
But that's essential, and so in a sense these are challenges. But actually, if we can get to grips with them finally, this is how we get the economy on track. There are thousands of businesses out there with great careers, like the automotive sector, literally facing a skills crisis because it can't find that pipeline of talent. So if we can invest to connect great young talent up with fantastic employers and careers, then that's a win-win for absolutely all of us. So yeah, these are difficult challenges, but government is there to overcome them. Shane just rightly talked about the expertise in teaching. Well, we've introduced a skills and growth levy or apprenticeship levy around businesses investing money in developing talent. Actually, they can probably invest time as well. What's the policy agenda around incentivizing and supporting companies to think, you know what, actually, rather than person X retiring in the next couple of years, why don't we move to a 4 and a 1 scheme where they spend 4 days in the office and 1 day in college? These are the sorts of innovations now, knitting together employers as part of the solution far more strategically. And that's one of the reasons why I'm doing all of my work on social mobility with the Purpose Coalition, because I think when you introduced the apprenticeship levy as they did, you could kind of see the strategic opportunity, Adam, that this could be a much broader relationship and partnership. And it just needs policymakers, I think, to think big. And I hope that that's what Burnham is now going to do.
And Shane, as we're recording this episode of Newscast, there's another announcement related to this, or at least the government are saying it's related to this, which is providing a sort of a bursary for people to go on and do apprenticeships, if that's been a barrier before. Just explain how that's going to work.
So at the moment, there are a, in quotes, small number, because no one's quite sure of the number, of families.
Another thing that the government isn't able to measure
small
because of our
number,
stats. Okay.
Exactly. A small number of families who are on universal credit who are actually financially penalised if the 16-year-old in their household goes out to gets an apprenticeship. Obviously, we want more young people to go out and take an apprenticeship, but the universal credit benefit rules are such that that counts as an extra income. Essentially, they're no longer a full-time student, they're an apprentice. And so the government have resisted this up to now. Pat McFadden, who's the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions that looks after apprenticeships, he was asked about it specifically a few months ago, and was as close to categorical as he could have been in ruling this out. But he's obviously been lobbied. We don't know all of the details. There might be a kind of a drop in household income of about £4,500, which the government wants to make up through this bursary, so young people aren't disincentivized.
Interesting, because when you see the press release, which has just dropped, it sounds much bigger, because it sounds like, oh, the government's going to provide bursaries to loads of young people to encourage them to go into apprenticeships. But actually, it's just for a potentially quite small number of people in a very particular circumstance with their household finances.
Exactly.
Justine, thinking back to your time in office and the introduction of T-levels, looking back in that period, are you thinking, oh, there is other stuff I should have done. There is a way I could have won round the Treasury to get some more money, or there was something about our politics at the time that held me back. Basically, I'm trying to a fancy question about regrets.
I have zero regrets, Adam, actually. Sorry to say that.
No, that's fine.
Because I think we cracked on with the apprenticeship levy and landed that, dare I say, even though it had a government system that had to work effectively, which, always raises red flags in any Secretary of State mind. I think we were completely right to crack on with T-levels. And I actually remember being in a meeting with Philip Hammond and Theresa May where I was evangelising about how important I felt vocational education was for both the economy and social mobility, almost seeing some sort of a penny drop. So I think it's been a journey. I think what we haven't had, maybe until now we'll see, is the ambition around just how fundamental this is. In a sense, you almost need three things for this to work, I think. One is just high quality routes, whether it's vocational, academic, or something that sits over that. I still think, for what it's worth, I think there's a third route we need that isn't vocational, isn't academic, which is entrepreneurship. There's loads of young people who want to start their own business. There is still no pathway for somebody who has an amazing idea and wants to get on with it, and they're in education. But I'm sure we can get to that. You need that. You need great advice for people to make great choices. I've always said I never met a lawyer growing up in Rotherham. I never really seriously considered going into law. So I think the more choices, especially earlier in life, that you give people, the more advice and support they need. I grew up in a household where I just never knew it. I didn't meet anyone who had a career. If you'd asked me to define a career, I would have said it was a job where you were likely to get a promotion. But I didn't know anyone who was in a family doing those kinds of jobs. I just knew that I wanted one like that when I got a bit older. And then I think the third thing that is really interesting, and I'm sure Shane will relate to this, is if we've moved into an era where people are going to be changing jobs, AI is going to be changing careers and work. You almost need this concept of interoperability, where even if you say pick up 14 and think, hey, I'm going to go into the automotive sector, actually most of these sectors have a whole variety of completely different careers. You can start, in automotive, but fine, it can end up being a tech career. It can end up being a marketing career. You can go into finance. All of these different sectors have a whole range of careers. The key is making sure that whatever choices you're making at 14, 16, 18, it unlocks and opens doors for you in future life rather than closing them down. And so there are some principles, in a sense, that really matter. And I've said, employers are crucial in getting them to see this bigger picture. But I remember doing a dinner with some Northwest business leaders in Manchester. I think it would have been early this year. And I was really impressed at how strategically they thought as a pack in terms of the talent the region needed, what that meant for them as businesses. And I think maybe our new Prime Minister has seen how businesses can work collectively, powerfully, and that's what we need to see across a wider country now.
And Shane, that picks up on Andy Burnham's work in Manchester, which is crystallised in this thing called the MBAC, Manchester Baccalaureate. I've never really honestly understood what that was. I understood where it fits in the branding, and I know what it's the sort of the elements to, but I'd never quite cohered in my mind what was on offer there.
Yeah, I mean, really, the success of the MBAC, which is, for all intents and purposes, it is about branding. It's about packaging up a set of courses into me as the mayor of Manchester, telling you what I think you should do to thrive in this area. But the real success for me of the MBAC has been the way in which it's brought various stakeholders together to actually have a conversation about the kind of 14 plus education route, because it was very well positioned as a this isn't better than academic and going to university, but it's just another option that will get you to in a place where you could have a good life. And for me,
it was as much about clarifying what's available and what the options are and where they could lead to, rather than coming up with a whole load of new subjects or teaching in schools.
Exactly. But that was very carefully managed. So there is a danger and a risk with what Andy Burnham announced today, where we proclaim parity of esteem, but there isn't necessarily like parity of choice that comes along with it. So you can see a scenario in 5 or 6 years' time where all the progress that's been made on widening access to university goes backwards. We have lots of qualified but unemployed young people
maybe the government
in particular
wants
areas.
It to go backwards a bit because they want fewer people going to university.
It might well do, and it would be a very brave politician to actually come out and say that. But that again gets to the heart of the parity of esteem issue. What do schools put on their website if they don't say we have X number of students going to a Russell Group university? Do they say we've trained X number of plumbers, builders? Would that have the same pull and draw on their marketing efforts? So those are the kinds of conversations around accountability, school accountability, Ofsted, school league tables, performance tables, all those sorts of things, which I actually think is quite exciting.
And Justine, one last question for you that's on another topic. Lucy Powell, the Secretary of State for Education now, so your successor plus 10, has been on 5 Live with Matt Chorley, saying that she thinks that the student loan system is egregious, and while she cannot make any promises, student loans need looking at. You were there when the system was being created and bedded in. What's your take on it?
I was there when it had bedded in, and I went into the DfE and said, is it heresy or is this inherently unstable and needs to be reformed? And the answer to me at the time was, yes, it is heresy. But nevertheless, if you want to Google Justine Greening, Higher Education Fund, you'll see an article I wrote back in 2018 where I propose how we can update tuition fees and higher education funding. If only we had been able to have the ambition then, if only Parliament actually had been more tuned into some of these issues, I think we'd be in a much, much better place now than we actually are. And there's a little bit of this around Parliament getting ahead of these sorts of issues. I could see back in 2017, 2016, the current approach on tuition fees had sufficient political flaws that it wouldn't last forever. My attitude then was we need to get ahead of this because we shouldn't be reforming when we reach a crisis. But nearly 10 years later, we've got to exactly where I worried we would do, and now we're having to reform in a crisis. But I'm really happy to work with Lucy and anyone else on some of those ideas that I set out back then.
Sorry, I did not Google your entire back catalogue before the interview. Just back on that point about Parliament being behind the curve. Basically, if there had been the cohort of MPs there are now, lots of whom have massive student loans, 5 or 10 years earlier, you reckon the system would have been reformed by now? And actually, it was the problem not being visible enough to the MPs of the day.
Yeah, and that's not good enough, is it? Why should Parliament have to literally have people facing the crisis themselves as MPs before it actually is able to act? This is the whole problem. It's crisis management. We're having a discussion about policies, quite rightly, I think, announced by Andy Burnham, but we've reached a crisis on needs. This is precisely why I genuinely was passionate about social mobility being part of this overriding mission for the DfE. We have to have a version of politics in Britain that gets ahead of these problems and is looking into the future around the corner politically to stop problems from crystallising rather than simply just reacting to them once it's already happened. That people deserve better, and they deserve a version of Parliament, I think, that is looking ahead, not just not almost like a commentariat on things that have already gone wrong.
Interesting. And Shane, last question for you, Shane, and this is quite selfish for me, but if you are trying to help a young person, perhaps in your own family, who is not going to go down the traditional route of GCSEs, A-levels, university, graduate job, I mean, where'd you start? I mean, for example, where do you actually get the comprehensive info about what all the options are? Because as far as I can see, it doesn't exist.
It does exist. It's just all over the place.
Yeah.
It's not brought together into a coherent kind of UCAS. This is where you go for information about technical education. I mean, like, I would just point out that we're here today on a massive announcement on technical education, and we veer off into university undergraduate tuition fees and student loans, and that is part of the issue. I completely understand why you've done that, by the way.
I mean, we did do about 14 minutes of
14 minutes
stuff,
so
and then 2 minutes on student loans.
So I think that again, it comes down to that, where people have got access to information, doesn't it? So the information is out there. I would always recommend talking to your seeing who's around in your local area when it comes to your local further education colleges. Schools can sometimes be a little bit, please stay with us. Here's our sixth form. Here's what we do here. So you do have to widen your search to have a look around and see what's available. One of the things I think Andy Burnham needs to focus on next is actually how to get people physically moving around their local areas better in a similar way that he did in Manchester, because public transport for young people now is incredibly hard. So if we want them to travel a bit to go and do a construction course, they should be able to do that.
So much.
And one other thing, actually, Adam, is if you stay in your own school sixth form, the school can reclaim that on what it's spending. If you did as I did, and my school didn't have a sixth form, I went to my local FE college, that FE college is actually not able to reclaim VAT. So there's literally a VAT penalty for FE. And it's things like that that probably need to be sorted out if Burnham's going to be successful.
Yeah, but I suppose from a government point of view, they seem like quite small beer. When you're trying to solve a problem, and actually sometimes the effective small beer gets lost in the search for the big silver bullet, if I can mix my metaphors.
Most of those kids going to FE are kids in more disadvantaged areas, so it all ties into, are we going to pull all the levers we need to close those gaps or not?
We shall see. Justine, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Shane, good to meet you too.
Thank you.
Now, talking of Greater Manchester, on Thursday, hundreds of thousands of people will go to the polls to elect Andy Burnham's replacement as the mayor of Greater Manchester. So we thought we would reunite our friends from By-Electioncast. So joining us now down the line is Sarah Lester, editor of the Manchester Evening News. Hello, Sarah.
Hello.
And Kevin Fitzpatrick, political reporter for BBC North West and Radio Manchester. Hello again, Kevin.
Hi, how are you?
Very well, thank you. Now, before we dive into the by-election for the mayor, Sarah, what's the goss about number 10 North?
There's lots of goss about number 10 North, most of which I can't say here. But,
True goss. Okay, do the news goss rather than the goss.
Yeah, if you're in Manchester, it's great. It's great. And I think it's going to become perhaps a bit of a Friday tourist attraction, because looking at the crowds that were there and the colour from the day outside. I don't know whether you were there, but the day outside for our journalists was fascinating, with weddings taking place and an occasional drunk person lumbering past, and it was absolutely fascinating. But on more seriously, I think it's just really good, and I know it has its detractors, but I think it's really important for people to see power in their area, and it heralds a seriousness about the desire to shift power into the regions. I personally think it's much more than a gimmick, although of course the proof will be in what decisions are actually taken up here, what meetings are, and how often he comes up here as well.
Well, yeah, because Sarah, I was going to ask, you must have seen a lot of photo ops that actually were just that, and people trying to sort of pay lip service to being in the north or dropping in to have a cabinet meeting in the north. Did this feel more substantial than some of those old ones?
It felt more serious, and the players that are there and the kind of non-politicians that are there, a lot of whom we know because of their background in Manchester, they're serious players, so it feels like a much more serious enterprise. I mean, we've stopped going to the vast majority of photo calls where somebody just wants to show that they've been through a northern town once, whereas this does feel different and quite hopeful and quite interesting, and quite and entertaining in some ways as well, certainly for the crowds. I think my understanding is the police put up barriers and because they weren't sure if anybody would come, and then loads of people come. So I've got a feeling it might be like a nice Friday afternoon, sunny afternoon, little pastime for people.
What, go and see if you can get a glimpse of the PM?
Yeah, perhaps.
Interesting. And Kevin, what was it like for you on Friday?
Yep. Well, I was there in Albert Square for a period, and there was a huge police presence. There was a few people questioning the cost of it, really, because he came in the back. They were having to shut roads, and there was police around the whole time. But Andy Burnham answered that because he was kind of aware that the criticism was going to come, not just about the cost of him travelling up here, but the cost of the policing operation. And he said, well, how much does it cost for everybody up here to go down to London every week? But it did strike me, I was stood in Albert Square, and the town hall, the Manchester Council Town Hall, is just across that square, and in between the two buildings I could look up and look through the windows of the big room where back in 2016, I think it was, George Osborne came up as Chancellor, and all the leaders around here signed the first devolution agreement that ended up getting them the mayor, which clearly has led to the process where Andy Burnham described it as the best day of his life, to see this power potentially, he hopes, he intends, doesn't he, to be transferred up to the city. So it was a nice juxtaposition, really. I looked in one room and looked across to the other building and thought, right, well, things really have moved significantly in the last decade.
Right, that's number 10 North. Let's dive into the election then to find a new mayor for Greater Manchester. Sarah, just give us the context.
So this is a really big deal for us. So Greater Manchester, 3 million people, Burnham's replacement. In the sort of runners and riders, the favourite is Bev Craig, who is a well-respected leader of Manchester City Council. Really interesting character. She's very effective, got good history of delivery, clever, has nowhere near the profile of Burnham, and has been interesting. She's been making campaign videos, running and doing a lot of the kind of Burnham style campaign videos, because her profile was not anywhere near where Burnham was. She's an interesting character. She's from Belfast. She came over here at 18, knew no one, no friends, nothing, and now is standing for mayor. She's been quite influential to Burnham over his career, I think, particularly the latter bit since she's been leader in the last few years. She was deputy mayor and has, I think,
been quite an influence. So she's obviously the favourite there. We had a story of the week revealing that Keir Starmer had wanted her to stand in Gorton and Denton, but she hadn't wanted to. That she saw her future here, and also I think didn't want to do his dirty work either. So that's Bev. So probably the main rival is Sian Astley, who's a really interesting candidate. She's from Reform. What we found is that the focus, with everything that's going on with Farage, the focus has really shifted to Clapton. So I don't think the ground operation, it doesn't feel like it anywhere, has been what we expected it to be. She's a different sort of candidate to the Makerfield Reform candidate. She's more media savvy. She's not a politician in the way that he wasn't. She's a landlord. She's got TV background. She was a presenter. She's very personable. She's quite reasonably well known in the area, and she's had a decent campaign. Bit of controversy, some of social media post where she suggested that Green politicians should be made to house rapists if they're not happy with the reform immigration perspective. So that was kind of the most interesting that happened around her. I think the other candidate of interest is Geraldine Coggins, who's from a Trafford councillor. I should have said actually Sian is a Manchester councillor as well, a new one. But Geraldine Coggins is a Trafford councillor. She's highly educated, philosopher, I think, background. We did a hustings and she was a really strong performer. We did a football player style ratings afterwards and she actually won on that. The Greens are kind of trying to create a narrative that they're the only ones to stop reform, but that does not bear out in the polls at all. So we think Bev is likely to win. We'll talk about, presumably you'll ask me in a bit about the voting system because it's slightly different for this election. But
you know that's what I was going to ask Kevin, was that actually we all have had quite a lot of experience of watching elections in the Northwest in the last few months because of the Makerfield by-election and Gorton and Denton. But actually we shouldn't just take the lessons and the experiences from those Westminster by-elections for constituencies and apply them to just the bigger scale of Greater Manchester, should we?
No, and Greater Manchester is a hugely varied place. And while you can pick certainly things out of the local elections back in May, where Reform did particularly well, but they did well across the north of Greater Manchester in particular, you can take some lessons from Gorton and Denton, where the Greens swept to victory, didn't they, in kind of that part of central Manchester with big diverse communities, and also they did quite well in the local elections in kind of the southern areas. So you take your lessons from them and we end up with a battle between Green and Reform, don't we? And Labour really are on the ropes. But then you look at the Makerfield by-election and Burnham sweeps to victory there, beating Reform comprehensively, and with the story of him now returning to Parliament, heading into Downing Street in the way that he has, and the boost that appears to have given the Labour Party, it really is tricky to kind of pin any of those scenarios onto this mayoral by-election. And in terms of the voting system, it's not first past the post here this time. It's supplementary vote. It was supplementary vote for the first two mayoral elections in Greater Manchester. The third, by that point, the Conservative government had brought first past the post in, but it never mattered anyway because Andy Burnham was winning all of those elections with 60-70% of the vote. He was winning the majority in every single ward in the 10 boroughs. However, at this election, the expectation is that nobody is going to get 50% of the vote on the first round of voting, and that is where the supplementary vote, the second choices that people have, would kick in. And that's why it could be really important if people decide to use the second vote, but also who they choose to vote for with that.
Yeah, and Sarah, how are you then sort of wargaming that voting system in your head for when it comes to the last few days of the campaign and also the first day of the results?
So I think my guess is that so the results of Friday, they're not overnight, sadly, as I love an overnight count. They're sort of lunch. We expect mid-afternoon on Friday. I be surprised if Bev gets, you need 50%, that 50% to win. So I think the second vote will count. If I was betting on it, I'd probably say, Bev Craig would do it then, would just about do it, but it's by no means, nothing's certain ever in an election. I think there will be an issue over, turnout. Turnout's always been around 30-odd%. And one of the things we found whilst out talking to people is there's a lack of an awareness of this election around Greater Manchester. And actually, it could be one of the most influential, in terms of impacting directly on people's lives. It's hugely significant, but turnout could potentially be quite low. And so, some people didn't even quite understand what they were voting for, even though they were trying to vote. So we're spending a lot of time trying to explain to people the voting system and what they are voting for, and in making sure we're interviewing every candidate.
But Sarah, do you have a theory, and not getting you to psychoanalyze or speak for every single voting age citizens in the patch, but do you have a theory for why people are still not sure what's going on, even though there's been wall-to-wall coverage on the news, and not even on the news elsewhere, of the mayor of Greater Manchester becoming the Prime Minister?
Well, you don't want to get deep into this, but I do think we've got a problem with education around democracy and for kids. And actually, I don't think we talk enough about how our country runs, and a lot of people just switch off from news. So I think, some people think that, oh, well, it's Labour's because it's Manchester, so I won't vote, which is probably not by no means a dead cert. So maybe there's an element of that. And some people are battling their lives and cost of living and are kind of apathetic to the fact that politicians can make a difference. Obviously, Andy Burnham did cut through that. And it's probably worth saying, actually, that although he's not part of this election, he sort of looms large over it, in that certainly during our hustings and during all the other hustings and the conversations between the candidates, the record of Labour in Greater Manchester has been challenged by the non-Labour candidates, particularly around, obviously there's this great success story that Greater Manchester is growing economically when the rest of the country isn't. That's great. But there is a view that has enabled the city centre, and it hasn't trickled down to some of the towns and villages around Greater Manchester. And the issue around left behind communities and rough sleeping, which is obviously very salient because of what Andy Burnham said about wanting to end it. It hasn't ended in Greater Manchester. So those are the arguments that have been talked about. And I do think, that depiction of a kind of northern utopia is ripe for challenge, because we still have, 28%, I think, of our kids are growing up in poverty in Greater Manchester. And those issues, which actually the mayor doesn't necessarily have control over all of them, cost of living, those issues have been right at the fore of the conversations. Housing has been there as well. And the difference between, rich and poor in our patch has been a really, really key issue. So Burnham's record has loomed large. And of course, Bev is regarded as the sitting candidate. And so what she's been very clear on is that she wants to go much further. And of course, it's fair to say, I think, that Andy Burnham's recognised the limitations of the mayoral role, and that's why he's looking at more fiscal devolution, isn't he, into the regions, giving mayors more power, because he found that there was only so much he could do, or he would say that, I think.
And Kevin, that's some of the issues that have cropped up on the campaign trail and in the hustings. Have there been any actual stories? Because I haven't really seen any kind of classic election stories around this election.
There haven't really. None have jumped out. And I think partly because the media's been so dominated by what's been going on down at Westminster that this election hasn't had the attention that it perhaps would have. The Green Party have been trying to push lines quite strongly, criticising the Labour Party, some of the things Andy Burnham's been saying, and trying to turn that into a story locally. Reform have been, criticising quite a few elements of what Andy Burnham's done, and again trying to jump on perhaps the attention that Andy Burnham's been getting and reflect that on the situation here in Greater Manchester. But as Sarah says, a real theme has been that comparison with what Andy Burnham did, and how a big question for all the candidates really is, are you going to carry on doing what Andy was doing? Are you going to expand or intensify some of his key projects, or are you going to scale some of them back? And I think the big themes that have come out, we've been saying, rather than at the local elections and the general elections, what are the issues that kind of matter to you? And often it's been cost of living. We've been saying, right, well, you know, the mayor has these specific powers over public transport, strategic planning and housing, about supporting the economy. What would you want your mayor to do with those powers? And we've also been asking those specific questions of the candidates. And on public transport, you know, you've got Labour, you've got the Greens, you've got the Lib Dems wanting to expand the free bus travel that has been very popular with 16 to 18-year-olds under Andy Burnham. The Conservatives, they're saying, well, we need to review that. You know, we don't know we can still afford these freebies. And then a big diversion in numbers of houses that they're promising to build, and how they would make that happen. And then another big question that's come up with all the candidates is this idea that Manchester's done very well. And when we talk about Manchester booming, really, we're talking about the city centre, and the rest of Greater Manchester needs a lot more support than it has got previously. And under Andy Burnham, only last November, they launched what they called a Good Growth Fund. And this was 30 projects, 3 projects, economic projects aimed at boosting the local economies in each of the 10 boroughs. And the money was being provided from within Greater Manchester to kickstart those. So a question for them all has been, well, are you going to carry on with that? And they're all saying yes. And then obviously they've all got their own plans for how they would try and boost the high streets, which are feeling a little unloved at the moment.
So interesting. And we look forward to hearing what the result is, as Sarah was saying, on Friday afternoon. Sarah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Kevin, thanks to you too.
Thank you.
And I will see both of you for a pint in the Slug and Lettuce when I finally get to visit number 10 North, because of course that is the pub that's on the ground floor, isn't it?
It is. Looking forward to it.
And you know what I'm going to do now? I'm going to read out a list of all the candidates who are standing in the by-election to become Mayor of Greater Manchester. For Reform UK, there's Cyan Astley. For the Green Party, it's Geraldine Coggins. Bev Craig is standing for Labour. Phil Eckersley is standing for the Conservatives. There's an independent called Marcus Farmer. The Liberal Democrats have fielded Richard Kilpatrick. And Restore Britain are represented by Marlon West. And that full list is also available on the BBC News website. And that's all for this episode of Newscast. You can listen to us every single day as a podcast, and you can download us from BBC Sounds. And we'll be back with another episode of Newscast very soon. Bye-bye.